The café had always been a place of comfort for Nicholas, a little nook in the bustling city where life slowed down. The familiar clink of cups and the hum of conversations used to soothe him. But today, everything felt different. The tiny café seemed to close in around him, the air too thick, the sounds too sharp. He sat across from Victoria, who was uncharacteristically silent. Her fingers traced the edge of the chipped mug in front of her, her gaze distant. She hadn't touched her coffee. Nicholas noticed that, but he didn't comment. He was too caught up in the strange feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. Victoria finally looked up, her eyes locking onto his. They were no longer the eyes he remembered, full of laughter and light. Now, they were clouded, burdened with something he wasn't ready to face. She drew in a shaky breath, and in that moment, Nicholas knew whatever she was about to say would change everything. "Nicholas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we can't keep doing this." He flinched at the words, but before he could respond, she continued, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm pregnant." Nicholas felt the world tilt beneath him. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and unforgiving. Pregnant. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. They were young, too young. They had plans, dreams that didn't include this. What? His voice cracked, betraying the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "Victoria, how?" She gave him a sad, almost apologetic smile, but there was no trace of humor in it. "How do you think, Nicholas? We were careless, and now we have to deal with the consequences." He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. They had talked about their future, about the things they wanted to achieve before even thinking about starting a family. But now, that future seemed to be crumbling right before his eyes. "I don't know what to say," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. I didn't expect this." Victoria's hand tightened around the mug, her knuckles turning white. "Neither did I, but it's real, Nicholas. We can't ignore it. We need to decide what we're going to do." The urgency in her voice cut through his confusion, but all he could think about was running. Germany. His parents were leaving for Germany in a few days, and they had invited him to join them. It seemed like an easy out, a way to buy time, to escape this suffocating reality. Maybe if he went with them, everything would make sense again. He could figure things out from a distance, without the pressure of Victoria's pleading eyes. "I need time to think," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. He couldn't meet her gaze. It's a lot. I just need some time." Time. Victoria's voice was strained, and she finally released the mug, letting her hands fall to the table. "Nicholas, it's been weeks. I've been waiting, hoping you'd come around, but I can't wait forever. I need to know if you're going to be here for me, for us." He felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, suffocating him. But instead of confronting that weight, he looked away, searching for an escape. "Victoria, I just need a little more time, okay? I promise I'll figure it out." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The café seemed to fade into the background, the noise of clinking cups and quiet conversations dulling into a distant hum. Finally, Victoria sighed, a sound so heavy it felt like the final note in a long, sad song. "Nicholas, I can't do this alone," she whispered. "But if you're not ready, if you're not willing to be a part of this, then maybe I'll have to." Her words hung in the air between them, an unspoken ultimatum. Nicholas knew what she was asking, what she needed. But the fear gnawing at him wouldn't let him answer. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He stood up. "I'll call you, okay? We'll talk more later," he mumbled, already turning to leave. He avoided the look in her eyes, the look that begged him to stay, to choose her. But he couldn't. Not now. As he walked out of the café, he felt her eyes on his back, but he didn't turn around. The door swung shut behind him, the finality of the sound echoing in his mind. He knew, deep down, that he had just walked away from something he could never get back. The hum of the plane engines droned in Nicholas's ears, a constant reminder of the distance he was putting between himself and everything he had left behind. Germany stretched out beneath him, an escape wrapped in the promise of a fresh start. But as the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign blinked off, the knot in his stomach only tightened. He told himself this was the right choice, that he needed time to think, to figure things out. Yet, deep down, he knew he was running. Germany wasn't new to him. His parents had lived here on and off for years, and he had visited countless times. But this time felt different. The streets of Frankfurt, usually bustling with life and energy, seemed colder, more distant. His parents welcomed him warmly, of course, but even in their company, he felt like a stranger, an imposter in his own life. Nicholas threw himself into his father's business, hoping that the relentless pace of meetings and negotiations would drown out the guilt that festered inside him. It worked, at first. The long hours and constant pressure kept his mind occupied. But at night, when the world quieted, the memories would creep back in, the look on Victoria's face when he left her in that café, the desperation in her voice as she begged him to stay. One evening, after another exhausting day at the office, Nicholas sat alone in his apartment, nursing a glass of scotch. The phone sat on the table beside him, taunting him with its silence. He hadn't called Victoria. He hadn't even sent a message. Every day that passed made it harder, the distance between them growing like a chasm. He stared at the phone, his thoughts swirling in a toxic mix of regret and fear. Just pick it up. Call her. But every time he reached for it, his hand hesitated. What could he possibly say? How could he explain the weeks of silence? And what if she told him she had made a decision without him? What if she had moved on? As the alcohol numbed his senses, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting the darkness swallow him. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow, I'll call. But tomorrow came and went, and the call never happened. 6 months had passed when Nicholas returned to England, the trip nothing more than a brief stopover on his way to Italy. The business was expanding, and his father needed him to oversee a new venture. Nicholas had convinced himself that this was progress, that he was building something. Yet the success he once craved now felt hollow, tainted by the guilt he could no longer ignore. It wasn't until his plane landed at Heathrow that he finally dialed Victoria's number. His fingers trembled as he pressed the buttons, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. Hello? Her voice, so familiar yet so changed, echoed through the receiver. It was softer now, more tired. Victoria. It's me. Nicholas. His voice wavered, betraying his uncertainty. There was a long pause on the other end. He could hear her breathing, could almost imagine her standing there, phone in hand, deciding whether or not to speak. Nicholas, she finally said, her tone measured. It's been a while. Yeah. I know. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but it was all he could manage. I wanted to see how you're doing. How things are. There was another pause, longer this time, before she responded. I'm fine. We're fine. But you didn't call just to ask that, did you? No, he admitted, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. I wanted to see you. Can we meet? Her hesitation was palpable. He could sense the battle raging inside her, the struggle between wanting to protect herself and the part of her that still cared. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed. Okay. Meet me at the park by the old oak tree. You remember the place. I'll be there. The evening was cool when Nicholas arrived at the park, the sky tinged with the soft colors of dusk. The old oak tree stood tall and imposing, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. He felt a pang of nostalgia as he approached it, remembering the countless times they had met here, back when things were simpler. Victoria was already there, standing by the bench with a stroller beside her. The sight of her took his breath away. She was thinner than he remembered, her face pale and drawn, but there was a quiet strength about her that hadn't been there before. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. Nicholas. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the edge beneath it. She glanced down at the stroller, and his heart sank as he saw the tiny bundle inside. "Our son," she said quietly. "His name is Dave. He was born early. Too early. He has health issues. Serious ones." Nicholas stared at the fragile infant, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Guilt hit him like a wave, threatening to drown him. This was his son, his flesh and blood, and he hadn't been there. He hadn't even known. I'm sorry," he stammered, the words feeling hollow. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp. "You weren't here, Nicholas. You left. You left me to deal with all of this alone." Her words cut deep, but Nicholas couldn't deny the truth in them. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I thought you might. Take care of it," he mumbled, hating himself for even saying it. "Take care of it?" Victoria's voice was cold, filled with disbelief. "You mean get rid of him? Is that what you were hoping for?" Nicholas winced, the accusation slicing through him. "No. I don't know. I was scared, Victoria. I didn't know what to do. And you think I did?" She stepped closer, her eyes flashing with anger. "I was scared too, Nicholas. But I didn't run. I stayed, and I fought for him. For us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Nicholas felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him, crushing him. He had abandoned her, abandoned their child, and now he had to face the consequences. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry, Victoria." She looked at him for a long moment, her anger slowly fading into something else, something more painful. "I know you are," she said softly. "But that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the fact that I had to do this on my own." She turned away, her shoulders slumping with the weight of it all. Nicholas took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, but then he stopped. What could he possibly say to make this right? What could he do now? "You decided to have him without me," he said finally, his voice laced with bitterness he hadn't intended. "You chose this. You raised him alone, and you can continue to do that. I want nothing to do with this." The words felt like poison on his tongue, but they were out before he could stop them. Victoria flinched as if he had struck her. She turned back to him, her eyes filled with hurt and disbelief. "You really are a coward, Nicholas," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought maybe you'd changed. But I see now I was wrong." He couldn't respond. The shame was too overwhelming. Instead, he turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. He didn't look back, not even when he heard the faint sound of Dave crying. Italy was supposed to be a new beginning, a fresh start. But for Nicholas, it turned out to be nothing more than a mirage, a fleeting dream that crumbled as quickly as it had appeared. The business ventures he had thrown himself into collapsed, one by one, his father's empire slipping through his fingers. He had squandered everything, from his inheritance to the trust his family had once placed in him. By the time he turned 40, Nicholas was a shadow of the man he had once been. The bright, ambitious young man who had walked away from Victoria and their son had faded into a bitter, broken shell. He found himself back in England, living in a rundown apartment, working menial jobs just to get by. The vibrant city that had once held so much promise now seemed cold and unforgiving, mirroring the emptiness inside him. One night, as he lay on the worn couch in his dingy apartment, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey, he let his mind wander back to that day in the park. Victoria's words echoed in his head, the pain in her eyes haunting him. He had thrown away everything that mattered, his family, his future, his chance at happiness. And now, all that was left was regret. But even regret, it seemed, wasn't enough to protect him from life's cruelty. A moment of distraction on a construction site, a single second of inattention, and suddenly, Nicholas's world came crashing down once again. The fall shattered his leg, leaving him with a permanent limp and a disability pension that barely covered his rent. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive, but he didn't feel lucky. He felt like a man who had wasted every chance life had given him. Nicholas sat alone in the sterile hospital waiting room, the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of footsteps the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. He had become all too familiar with places like this, the antiseptic smell, the cold linoleum floors, the walls painted in dull, neutral tones. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the pain in his leg a constant reminder of the fall that had brought him here. It had been months since the accident on the construction site. Months of hobbling around on crutches, of surgeries, and of lonely nights in his rundown apartment. The physical pain was bad enough, but it was the memories that tormented him the most. Every sleepless night was filled with the ghosts of his past, Victoria's face, the sound of Dave crying in that park, the life he had turned his back on. "Mr. Howard?" A nurse's voice broke through his thoughts, jolting him back to the present. He looked up, startled. "The doctor will see you now." Nicholas nodded and struggled to his feet, grabbing his cane. He limped down the corridor, each step an effort. The nurse led him to a small office, and as he entered, his eyes fell on the nameplate on the desk, Dr. Dave Howard. His heart skipped a beat. He knew it was just a coincidence, just a name, but still, it unsettled him. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the desk, and his breath caught in his throat. There, in the frame, was a picture of a woman with a warm smile, holding hands with a man who looked at her with love and devotion. Victoria. Older, yes, but unmistakably her. "That's my mother," a voice said from behind him, startling Nicholas. He turned to see a young man standing in the doorway, tall, with dark hair and a calm, professional demeanor. The resemblance was undeniable, even before the man introduced himself. "Dr. Dave Howard. You must be Mr. Nicholas Howard." Nicholas swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. Yes, that's right," he stammered. His mind raced. This was his son, the child he had abandoned, now a grown man, a doctor. The same man who would now determine his fate, though Nicholas felt unworthy of such care. Dave gave him a brief, professional smile and gestured to the chair. "Please, have a seat." Nicholas sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he placed his cane against the side of the chair. Dave sat across from him, flipping through a file. His face was calm, focused, but Nicholas could sense something deeper, a tension, a careful detachment. "I see you've had quite the journey with your leg," Dave said, glancing at the medical records. "The injury was severe, but from what I can tell, you're healing. How have you been managing the pain?" "Some days are better than others," Nicholas replied quietly, avoiding Dave's gaze. "The nights are the worst." Dave nodded, his expression neutral. "That's to be expected. I'll prescribe something to help you sleep." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "It must be difficult, being on your own." The words hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Nicholas felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded, feeling the weight of his failures pressing down on him. "Yeah," he muttered. "It is." Dave continued to ask questions, his tone professional, his demeanor controlled. But Nicholas could feel the distance between them, the barrier that years of absence and abandonment had erected. As the conversation dragged on, Nicholas's guilt grew heavier with every passing moment. Finally, Dave closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "That should cover everything for now, Mr. Howard. We'll monitor your progress and adjust your treatment as needed." He hesitated, his eyes finally meeting Nicholas's. There was something there, curiosity, maybe even a flicker of emotion, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?" Nicholas opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words he needed to say, the confession, the apology, choked him, lodged in his throat like a thorn. He knew this was his moment, his chance to make things right. But fear held him back. What if Dave rejected him? What if he didn't want to know the truth? But he had to try. He owed it to himself, and more importantly, he owed it to his son. Yes, Nicholas finally said, his voice shaking. There is something important. Dave raised an eyebrow, waiting. I'm your father, Nicholas blurted out, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His hands trembled as he spoke. The man who abandoned you and your mother. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve to be here, but I needed to tell you. I'm sorry. For everything. The room fell into a heavy silence. Dave stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Nicholas thought he had made a terrible mistake, that he had lost whatever small chance he had at redemption. Then, slowly, Dave leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. You're right, he said quietly. You don't deserve to be here. And I don't owe you anything. Nicholas flinched at the words, but he nodded, accepting the judgment. But, Dave continued, his tone softer now, I've spent years thinking about you. About the man who left my mother to raise me on her own. And you know what? She never once spoke badly of you. She always told me you weren't a bad man, just scared. Nicholas swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes. I was terrified. And I made the worst possible choices because of it. Dave's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained guarded. I don't know if we can ever have a real relationship. Too much has happened, and there's too much we don't know about each other. But I also know that holding on to anger won't change anything. My life turned out okay, despite everything. And I think that's because my mom chose not to let your mistakes define her. Nicholas nodded, tears finally spilling over. He couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to express the overwhelming mix of emotions coursing through him. Relief, guilt, hope, all of it crashed over him like a wave. Dave stood up and walked over to the door, opening it and gesturing for Nicholas to leave. Take care of yourself, Mr. Howard. And maybe we'll talk again. Nicholas stood, his legs shaking, and grabbed his cane. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at his son. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for giving me this chance. Dave nodded but said nothing, his expression unreadable once more. Over the next few weeks, Nicholas found himself returning to the hospital, not for medical reasons, but to see Dave. Their conversations were brief, cautious, and often filled with awkward silences, but they were talking. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One day, as they sat in Dave's office, Nicholas mustered the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since their first meeting. How is your mother? Nicholas asked hesitantly. Dave looked at him, then down at his hands. She's happy. She remarried when I was 6. My adoptive dad. He's been amazing. Raised me like his own. I owe a lot to him. Nicholas felt a pang of jealousy, but it was quickly replaced by gratitude. I'm glad she found someone who could be there for her. Someone better than I was. Dave didn't respond, and the silence stretched between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter. She's still the same, you know. Kind, forgiving. Too forgiving, sometimes. Nicholas smiled sadly. That sounds like her. Dave nodded, then looked up, his gaze more direct. She doesn't hate you, you know. She never did. She's open to seeing you again. If you're ready for that. Nicholas's heart skipped a beat. The thought of seeing Victoria again, after all these years, filled him with both hope and dread. I don't know if I'm ready, he admitted. But I want to try. Dave gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Take your time. She'll be here when you're ready. In the months that followed, Nicholas slowly began to rebuild his connection with both Dave and Victoria. It wasn't easy, there were setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when the weight of the past felt too heavy to bear. But through it all, they persevered. For the first time in years, Nicholas felt a glimmer of hope. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, he realized. It was about facing it, owning up to it, and finding the courage to make things right. And as he stood beside Dave and Victoria, looking out at the world that had once seemed so bleak and unforgiving, Nicholas knew that, despite everything, he had been given a second chance. A chance to be a better man. A chance to make amends. A chance to finally, truly live. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.